is Hannah Shankar from the University of Newcastle, Australia. Hannah received a PhD in 2007 from Monash University, Australia, on local helioseismology within strong surface magnetic fields, supervised by Paul Kelly. During her PhD, she closely worked with Doug Brown at Boulder. In 2007, she joined as a postdoc in Max Planck Institute for Solar System Research, where she continued her work as a project scientist and then staff scientist in Lauren Gison's group until 2020. In 2020, she took up a lecturer position at the University of Newcastle, Australia, and she is there now. And today, she will be speaking on closing the solar cycle, emerging active regions.
Thank you, Masumi. It's lovely to be able to give this presentation despite being so far away. And thank you for accommodating my different time zone, but I think this works well for everyone. So thank you for everyone for being able to come. I'm going to speak about emerging active regions today. A lot of you would have heard the first part of this talk, but I encourage you to stick around for the end of the talk, please. This work has been done in close collaboration, and it started when I was working at the Max Planck with Aaron and Doug, Robert and Laurent, and a host of other people, which you will hear about through this talk. So active regions are defined by their observation in intensity light of the sun. So what we are seeing here are intensity observations from the Solar Dynamics Observatory. And you can see these dark regions on the surface of the sun, which we call active regions. And they're defined as an active region only as soon as they become observable in the intensity. In a lot of these active regions, and you see a large one passing the screen here, are sunspots. So these active regions cause darkenings, and very often they are associated with the formation of these sunspots with the dark umbra surrounded by the penumbra. You will also see that they tend to emerge closer to the equator, so up to 30 degrees latitude. You don't see any active regions at the poles of the sun. And you also note here that, yes, the sun rotates. So these have been our traditional long-term observations of active regions. But now we know that these darkenings that we see in the intensity are associated with strong concentrations of magnetic field at the surface. Here we are looking at a line of sight magnetic field magnetogram from the Solar Dynamics Observatory. And you see that these sunspots are associated with these strong concentrations that you see here. So these regions of strong magnetic field are the active regions, but you'll also note that the entire sun is covered with magnetic field. There's small scale magnetic field everywhere that doesn't necessarily present as a darkening in the intensity. What you will also notice is that these active regions occur in pairs of opposite polarities. So these are what I call a bipole, so the opposite polarity pairs. Even the weaker field tends to occur in these pairs. In the northern hemisphere, the leading polarity, so the polarity in the direction of rotation, has a negative polarity. In the southern hemisphere, the polarity is opposite. So this is positive. So this is what is known as Hale's law. And this is a statistically true observation that the polarity that is in the prograde direction is opposite in the two hemispheres. And this changes with each solar cycle. Another empirically observed law, which is statistically true, is Joy's law. So Joy's law is a reflection of the orientation of the polarities. You can see already from this observation that the polarities tend to be east-west, roughly east-west aligned. But what you'll see is that if you track the position of the polarities, statistically what you get is that the leading polarity, so the leading polarity in the direction of rotation, is closer to the equator than the following polarity. And you see the same here for this pair of polarities. But you'll also see cases where this is not true. So this is a statistically true law. On average, most active regions have a leading polarity that is closer to the equator. And this tilt angle increases with latitude. So active regions at higher latitude are more tilted than active regions at lower latitudes. So this can be an important component in some dynamo theories. I'm not going to focus on talking about Joy's law today, but it is an important factor that we need to understand. Now, if we watch a movie of the magnetic field, so here we are seeing the evolution and the dynamics of the magnetic field on the surface of the sun. So we can see, I love this sunspot here. It just looks like it's moving in the opposite direction. You can see the strong regions of magnetic field. You can see the small scale changes that are happening here. You will also see active region emerge onto the surface of the sun. So from the observations, if you can follow my mouse here, we see that the magnetic field emerges from the interior of the sun. There is a strong magnetic field somewhere in the interior that emerges onto the surface, causing these active regions. We see that the polarities start off small and close together. And then as time goes by, they grow and become stronger and larger. So the question is, where do these active regions come from? On long-term averages, we have here latitude and time. And here we are looking at the magnetic field now in yellow and blue. So this is the polarity of the field. For long-term averages, we see the active regions here in these regions, which we call the butterfly diagram. At the beginning of a solar cycle, when the magnetic field is strongest, the active regions appear at higher latitudes, and towards the end of the cycle, they appear at lower latitudes. The sun then becomes quiet, and the next cycle begins. You can see here quite nicely that the flux from the active regions, as through time, gets transported up towards the poles. So you see the polarity at the poles of the sun are opposite. So the global field of the sun is kind of like a big dipole field. And this changes from cycle to cycle. And that's all because of these active regions at the surface. So these are playing a strong role. You can see this very clearly in these butterfly diagrams of this flux being transported and changing the polarity. So active regions are a key part of the dynamo process and understanding how this cycle is regenerated. And we know from our observations that this dynamo operates somewhere in the interior. So these active regions are converting the polarity of the global magnetic field. One way we think this is occurring is represented in this cartoon here. What you see at the surface is this mesh. So this is representing the surface of the sun, which we can see through to somewhere in the interior. Somewhere in the interior, there is a poloidal magnetic field. So it has some polarity, which is what these arrows indicate. Due to the differential rotation of the sun, so here is a little sketch of the solar rotation, it rotates faster at the equator than at the poles. The magnetic field gets wrapped around the rotation axis. And you end up with these opposite polarities in the hemispheres. Now, this strong field below the surface rises to the surface and pushes through. And this ends up in what we observe as active regions. So these are strong concentrations of opposite polarity magnetic field. This field is then transported to the surface, transported to the poles through the meridional flow, and we saw this in our butterfly diagrams. It's returned to the interior, and the cycle starts again with the opposite polarity. So this is matching up quite nicely with our observations. But there's a key part of this that we don't understand, is where the dynamo is located and how active regions arrive at the surface. So if we could constrain the subsurface structure or understand how the emerging active regions arrive at the surface, we would have a much better idea of where the dynamo sits inside the sun. So this is the idea behind looking at these emerging active regions and trying to understand physics of what's going on there. So the big question is, how do active regions form? We know active regions are darkenings on the surface of the sun. They often involve sunspots, which are associated with these strong concentrations of magnetic field that are in a roughly bipolar orientation, structure with a roughly east-west orientation. And they extend upward into these beautiful loops above the surface. So this is what we can observe from the surface out into the atmosphere. But what happens below the surface is not clear, or how they arrive at the surface. And just to really drive it home, this is a bad resolution for some reason, but nice time cadence observation of an emerging active region down here in the bottom of the sun. And so you can just really see the magnetic field emerging. It's going to come again here. It emerges close together. It starts to separate out. These are just beautiful movies. And you see that the flux arranges itself in this bipolar configuration. So this is just an example to really see how the flux emerges on the surface. So I put the two kind of broad classes of active region formation theory into passive and active. So a passive emergence is where the flux is generated, or these flux tubes are generated within the convection itself. And here is a kind of a whole sun simulation that involves convection. And you can see that the two hemispheres here have the opposite polarity. And you can imagine that these more concentrated flux tubes would emerge to the surface and push through. And that's what we would observe as the active regions. So this is what I'm calling a passive process, is when the convection is very involved in the process. On the right side, what you see is what I call an active emergence. So here we have a thin flux tube emerging from somewhere below the convection zone or deep in the convection zone, moving up towards the surface of the sun, and convection is not involved at all. Convection is completely ignored. So this is this is what I call an active emergence. So it's all dependent on the flux just barging through the convection zone towards the surface. So we have these two classes. Now, if we could understand, if we can constrain the difference between how active regions emerge, we would have a better idea if the dynamo is generated somewhere within the convection zone itself, or whether it sits somewhere deeper down and is more of this toroidal field picture that we looked at previously. So one way we can see below the surface to understand what's going on is to use helioseismology. So helioseismology is a tool we have to probe the subsurface structure and flows and dynamics of the sun. In this case, what I'm going to be talking about is the flows, particularly the convective flows. In this picture, in the active theory, so for thin flux tube theory, as a flux tube rises through the convection zone, it passes through a density stratification, and because it's less dense towards the surface, material flows down the legs of the flux tube, and so you get flows within this flux tube. What you're seeing at the bottom here is a function of height and longitude. So it's kind of this top picture kind of just unwrapped into a Cartesian box there. And what you see near the apex of the flux tube are retrograde flows of about 100 meters per second. So this is the material flowing down the legs of the flux tube. On top of this are ray paths for helioseismic waves. And so we can use these wave paths to probe the subsurface flows, predict, and to see if these flows can be detected. So the amplitude of these flows are about 100 meters per second, and this is at about 20 megameters below the surface and at about 1 day before they would emerge onto the surface. And it has been estimated that there would need to be about 100 active regions to increase the signal that it would be a meaningful measurement to constrain these flows. So we'd need 100 active regions to measure the flows below the surface with helioseismology. So this study was done. I have missed out 3 very important papers. Oh no, they're up here. The papers are up here, which attempted to do this using SOHO MDI observations. And no significant signal was found. But it was only up to 20 megameters below the surface and up to 1 day before. And you will notice that these simulations stop before reaching the surface, because this is where convection becomes really important. So maybe we should be looking deeper and further back in time. And we should also be taking into account this region near the surface. And now we have NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory, which observes all the sun all the time. So one difficulty with understanding emerging active regions is that we don't know when or where one will emerge. So it's absolutely essential to have these monitoring campaigns that just constantly look at the full disk of the sun and make high resolution observations. Without this, these studies are simply not possible. We can't guess well, we'd have to be very lucky to be able to guess where an active region would emerge, and statistical analysis wouldn't be possible. So thanks to STO, we are now in a unique position to place tighter constraints on how active regions emerge due to these beautiful observations, in addition to the realistic quantitative 3D MHD numerical simulations, which I will show the results from, which allow us to compare, directly quantitatively compare the surface observations with the simulations to constrain the subsurface physics. I need to introduce the STO Helioseismic Emerging Active Regions Survey. So given these beautiful observations we have put together a catalogue of 185 clean emerging active regions. So they are clean because we want them to emerge into relatively quiet sun. Helioseismology has we have difficulties interpreting the results of helioseismology when there is strong surface magnetic field present. So we're trying to avoid these issues and look at active regions that emerge into relatively quiet sun. So that's what I mean by clear. In addition, we have control regions, which are where active regions do not emerge. They're relatively quiet as well at the same latitude and longitude. So these active regions were from the previous solar cycle from 2010 to 2014. We track them as they rotate across the disk at the Carrington rotation rate. And this is up to 7 days pre and post emergence, depending on where they emerged on the disk. And these are at the 45-second cadence. And taking these mapped and tracked active regions, we end up with data cubes that are about 6 hours long as we track them across their passage across the disk. Excuse me. So we have the intensity, we have the line of sight magnetic field, and we have the Doppler velocity in these data cubes. The Doppler velocity is what we use to compute travel times for waves with turning points from the surface up to 70 megameters below. We did this using helioseismic holography. We then take the 45-second data cubes for the intensity and the line of sight magnetic field, and we average those. So what you'll see a lot of today is averaged line of sight magnetic fields with about a 6 hour cadence, and surface flows calculated from the velocities. So this is quite a large amount of data, and this is computed and stored at the German data center for STO at the MPS. So this is our data set. There's one thing I want to emphasize, and this is the emergence time. So it's hard to define an emergence time, but we were inspired by previous publications that looked at these emerging active regions, and we chose a consistent emergence time with that study. So here we have the flux of one particular active region as a function of time. So this is a few days over in February 2011. So we see the flux growing and growing and growing. This vertical line here is the active region time, when the active region was first given a number. So it's first appeared in the intensity observations of the sun, and it's given an active region number, 11158. We then look at the flux 36 hours after emergence, and we look at the value there. We define the emergence time as being when the flux was 10% of this value. So this here is the emergence time. So I just want to emphasize that there is a small amount of flux at the surface when these active regions emerge. So this is somewhat random, but it's reproducible and well-defined. And so this gives you two examples of active regions emerging in our data set. We have active region 11209. Time when it's negative is pre-emergence. If it's positive, it's post-emergence. The active region of interest is at the center of the maps here. So on the left, what you see is what I would call a rather small active region. You see the polarity emerge. They move further apart, and then the magnetic field kind of disperses. What is also interesting about this one, and why I show it, is that there are other emergences happening around the outside here. These two emergences in these two locations even seem to occur at the same time, which sort of suggests that perhaps something is happening beneath the surface that is common to both of them. But you'll also note that this active region here emerges into existing strong field. So this was one of the active regions that was not selected for our data set because it was not an example of a clean active region. On the right, what you see is active region 11158, which I just showed you previously. And this is the strongest active region in our data set. It's also it's quite complex. So it looks more like a double emergence, and you see the two polarities, the polarity pairs emerge, and then the flux kind of rearranges itself into its more traditional bipolar form. So this just also goes to show the range of what we call an active region has a broad range of characteristics. And if we want to understand the common physics, we need to have this statistical study. So case studies are important, but without understanding the common physics behind emergence, we really need this statistical understanding. So this is an example of the active regions in our survey. One note for the rest of the talk, we reverse all the active regions, so in the southern hemisphere, to look as though they were appearing in the northern hemisphere. So we reverse the latitude in the vertical direction, and we change the polarities. So even though active region 11158 appears in the southern hemisphere, and the leading polarity is inclined towards the equator, you will see the rest of the talk, it will be flipped the other way. And my point again, there is some flux present at the surface at the time of emergence. So if we just zoom into this region, I will show you the flux emergence and the flows of these two active regions, but 11158 will be flipped. So this is kind of the summary of what's in our data, well, what I'm going to talk about in this talk, and this what we're using in this data set. The background scale is the diverging flows. So white is a diverging flow and the gray scale is a converging flow. The arrows indicate the direction of the flow, and you can just very clearly and beautifully see the supergranulation scales of flows. On top of that, you see a few contours here, but mostly in 11158, and this shows the umbra and the penumbra of the sunspots forming. And it just shows how complex active region 11158 really is, and how the dynamics involved as it's emerging. What I also like to see that's quite intuitive more on the left side is that the flux is very much confined to lying between in the inflow lanes between these supergranules. So if you just look carefully at the flux emergence here, and you'll see it dispersing, there forms an inflow, and it spends a lot of time zooming between the supergranular inflow lanes, which is not a huge surprise. We know that flux likes to be between sit in supergranular lanes, but for the stronger field, this is not so clear. So this is a kind of a summary of the observations we have. So our goal is to understand the physics guiding active region emergence. We want to understand where active regions originate from, and this will help us understand where the dynamo lies. So there's three things I want to talk about in my story today. One, I will present the rise speed. So we don't really know what happens close to the surface for thin flux tubes. And we are going to use these 3D MHD simulations to directly compare it to the observations and constrain this. Secondly, I'm going to talk about surface flows. We want to understand what scales of convection are important and what flows are important. So I will talk about flows at the time of emergence, and I will also introduce the evolution of the flows as active regions emerge. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the flux emergence rate. Now, this stuff is kind of hot off the press, I would say. It has not been published, but I really want the audience's feedback, and I would like to share this with you and hear what you have to say about it. So rise speed of the flux tube. In our thin flux tube model, the rise speed is about 500 meters per second near the surface. So these are just storming through the convection. These models stop about 50 megameters below the surface when convection becomes important. So what was done with these beautiful three-dimensional MHD simulations of the near surface of the sun, here we have 18 megameters below the surface. We push through a flux tube through the bottom boundary with some upward rise speed. What you will see here is the magnetic field where I think white is stronger and black is weaker. Here you see downflows in blue and upflows below the surface. You'll see the intensity observations here and the line and the vertical magnetic field here at the surface. So we're pushing these thin flux tube models through to see what they look like at the surface in the presence of convection. You see the flux tube rise. You see flux starting to appear at the surface. You see the darkening in the intensity. And these are quantitatively comparable to the observations. These simulations are just that amazing that we can directly compare what we observe here with what we see here with what we observe. So if we take these surface observations, we take the surface of the simulations and we compute the surface flows. So here we are looking at the surface flows of this simulation when a flux tube was pushed through the bottom boundary with a speed of 500 meters per second. So it's roaring through the convection. This is the surface flow at the time of emergence. So there's a little bit of flux at the surface, which is represented here by these gray contours. And the diverging flow is in red and converging flows are in blue. And the arrows indicate the direction of the flows. So you see this enormous outflow. If we now do the same thing and look at the observations, this is for active region 11158, the strongest, most complex active region we have in our sample. You see immediately there is some flux at the surface, but we do not see anything like these enormous outflows. You see a bit of a supergranule here, but nothing at the location of emergence. If we push through a flux tube through the bottom boundary with a speed of 70 meters per second, we get something more like this. We see a little more flux at the surface, But we see that the flows and the magnitude of the flows are a lot more similar to what we see in the observations than this 500 meter per second rising flux tube. And I just want to point out that in none, I'm only showing 11158 here, but in none of the active regions that we have in our sample did we see this signal. So this suggests that active regions are emerging more at the convective velocities rather than speeding through at 500 meters per second. So this suggests that perhaps convection has more to do with the emergence, and the emergence process is more passive than active. I'm not sure if I actually left this plot in. Let me check. If we average the velocities in the central region of these active regions, I did. We end up with surface outflows given on the vertical axis here. So the simulation with a rise speed, so this is the rise speed of 500 meters per second, has these enormous outflows. If it's 70 meters per second, we have more moderate outflows. The red here shows the average from the observations, which is actually on average an inflow. And this shows the standard deviation, the uncertainties here. A few individual active regions, and active region 11158, which you saw, is shown here way out on the edge. So this is really the strongest active region outflow we observe. So it seems that active regions really are emerging, not at enormous speeds like it's in the thin flux tube model, but at something more moderate. So let's take a look at the average surface flows. We looked at the individual surface flows and we looked at a statistical distribution there. Let's have a look at the average. So here we have averaged the surface flows over 41 active regions, 35 hours before emergence. So here we have Y, here we have X. The white indicates the location of the emergence. Again, we have diverging and converging flows in red and blue. So we don't see anything particularly interesting in this. At 24 hours before emergence, again, we don't see anything particularly strong. We have supergranules here. We start to see some kind of inflow on the retrograde side. And at minus 13 hours, this signal becomes very, very strong. It becomes stronger than the noise around it. And at the time of emergence, we start to see flux emerge. So it seems from this that active regions, on average, prefer to emerge at the east-west end of an on the western end of an east-west oriented converging flow. So this suggested to us that perhaps they prefer to emerge in a particular place within the supergranulation, within the convection. So by locating the western point of east-west aligned converging flow lanes in the supergranulation flows and averaging them, we ended up with this map here. So this looks similar to what we found from the active region, but not exactly the same. We're missing this diverging flow at the top from the supergranule sitting on top and a supergranule sitting in the bottom. So again, it's suggesting, we have a suggestion that supergranulation is playing a strong role, but we're not totally convinced of this yet. So this is just before emergence. We see this preferred location. Now let's take a look at the evolution of average surface flows. So we're going to look past the emergence time. Flows are very important for the evolution of the surface magnetic field and generating the next cycle. Once the magnetic field arrives at the surface, the flows transport the active region in different ways. So we have the differential rotation, which we said was important in this model of dynamo this dynamo model, which stretched the magnetic field around the rotation axis. It then emerges onto the surface. And when the active region sort of dies or decays, diffusion takes over, magnetic field is diffused. And then we have the meridional flow, which transports the flux up to the poles or down to the poles to begin this next solar cycle. So the surface flows are very important in generating the next solar cycle. It is also known for quite some time that active regions tend to have these inflows surrounding them. So these are for established active regions. Here we have latitude, here we have Carrington longitude, and these are longitudinal averages. Established active regions have sort of widespread here inflows around them. And so this is acting against diffusion. So it's thought that these flows perhaps have something to do with the lifetimes of active regions. But if the magnetic field and the cooling itself is driving the flows, or if the flows themselves are creating the active regions, is not clear. So it's important to look at how these flows develop as a function of evolution to try and understand this. These maps are slightly different. In the background, we have the blue and red represents the polarities of the magnetic field. The arrows on top indicate the direction of the surface flows. These maps are divided into flux. So this is low flux, and we're moving up to higher flux. This is for the active regions. This indicates the number of active regions that have been averaged over. So I'm going to cycle through them as a function of time. So low flux is on the left, high flux is on the right. The active region is there at the center. This is at the time of emergence. So you can kind of see the polarities there already. And we notice that at 1 day before emergence, exactly like I showed before, we have these converging flows. So no surprises here. This is consistent, shown in a slightly different way. A little bit after emergence, we start to see the bipoles very clearly, low flux, high flux, looking very similar. If we go a little further in time, so we've got 1 day and 18 hours, we see that during emergence, a prograde flow develops. You see this prograde flow here. If we continue, I would argue here that at the lower flux end, we are seeing a strong inflow. Again, slightly higher. And finally, this is 4 days and 18 hours after emergence. We see that these north-south inflows set in. But the onset time of these inflows is dependent on the flux. The inflows set in earlier for the low flux rather than for the high flux regions. So there is definitely a flux-dependent quantity to these inflows. And it may have something to do with dictating the lifetime of these active regions. So now I've come to the part that has not been published, and I would like your feedback on, please. So now we're going to look at the average emergence, and what I've called this is based on the flux emergence rate. But let me explain this to you as I go through, and you can decide whether this is the important part. As I've spent a lot of time just watching movies of active regions emerge. And what I noticed was there was quite a few active regions where there was a bipole that seemed to hang around for a significant amount of time, not doing much. And then all of a sudden it turned into an active region. And I thought, a statistically significant number of these. And this is what I'm calling a pre-emergence bipole, a PEB. I need to work on that too. But this bipole is clearly associated with emergence at least 2 days before. So this is how I'm defining a PEB, a pre-emergence bipole. On the left, I'm going to show a movie of an example of one of these pre-emergence bipoles. So at the moment, I'm going forward in time, and you see the active region emerge. Then the movie will play in reverse, and it's easier to follow this polarity back in time. So it also moves a little bit in space. So this is an example of what I'm defining as a pre-emergence bipole. Just take another look at that one. On the right, we have an example of an active region that clearly does not have a pre-emergence bipole. It is not associated with a pre-emergence bipole. So you'll see this also playing forward and backwards in time. Again, following them backwards in time just makes it a little easier to follow the where they come from and whether there is anything present at the surface of the sun there. So I asked an undergraduate student actually to take a look at this data and have a look at these pre-emergence bipole regions and identify the ones with pre-emergence bipoles and identify one active regions that clearly do not have pre-emergence bipoles. So just to show an example a little more clearly, here we have the screen. Here we just have images of the emergence of a pre-emergence bipole. You can kind of see it here. And here is a one without a pre-emergence bipole. And you see at the time of emergence, so -3 hours, the flux just appears at the surface. So this is something to do with the flux emergence rate, I think, which is why I'm calling this the flux emergence rate. If we plot the mean magnetic field of all the pre-emergence bipoles that were found, the student's name is Cameron Ali, we see that before emergence, here's pre-emergence time, that there is magnetic field present at the surface for these pre-emergence bipoles. No surprise, this is why we chose them. The dashed lines here indicate the magnetic field from the control regions in the sample. And again, we don't see emergence, so we don't see an evolution there. But what was interesting was that if we follow these post-emergence, what we see is that the pre-emergence bipoles tend to be the lower flux regions. Higher flux regions are just barging through the surface, apparently. But the lower flux regions are not. They're hanging around for a while, and then at some point, something happens and an emergence occurs. So there are about 40 pre-emergence bipoles and equivalent number of non-PEBs were selected. If we average these, this is what we get. This is the average surface magnetic field for the pre-emerging bipoles. The contour here is for a particular flux value for all the active regions, so 180 of them, just to give reference. And here we have, again, no surprises, a huge emergence of flux at the time of emergence. Now let's take a look at the flows. On the left, we have the pre-emergence regions. These are averaged flows as a function of time. Converging flows in blue, diverging flows in red. So you see the converging flow before emergence. Again, no surprises there. We have discussed this and seen this quite a few times. We then see the prograde outflow, which was identified as a part of the evolution in the leading polarity. Now, if we take a look at the active regions without a pre-emergence bipole, we don't see any strong evidence of converging before emergence, a little bit, but it's not significant compared to what's happening around the active region. But we do see a strong outflow at the time of emergence. So these samples have distinctly different flow profiles, which suggests that we should be looking at subsamples of these active regions. We should be moving to looking at subsamples of these active regions to understand the flux emergence process. Are there two different processes that are going on, dependent on something, the flux emergence rate? So just to compare this is our pre-emergence region. Here we have at 33 hours and even perhaps at 51 hours before emergence, we see these strong converging flows. At the time of emergence, we don't see anything really significant. For the non-pre-emerging biopole regions, we don't see anything particularly significant, perhaps a low inflow here, and then a significant outflow at the time of emergence. And this is just comparing the two flow maps. So before, what we have been looking at is an average over all of these, where we saw this inflow, and then at the time of emergence, we saw the prograde outflow. But it seems these signals are coming from two separate classes of active regions. So our goal is to understand the physics guiding active region emergence and understand where the active regions originate, and this will help us understand where the dynamo lies, whether it's in the convection or whether it's more of an active process where convection is not so involved. And from our first results, it seemed that convection was playing a very strong role in the emergence process. Then we looked at the surface flows as a function of at the time of emergence and as a function of time. So at the time of emergence, we thought that it had something to do with the supergranulation. As a function of time, it seems that flux is also important, or the size of the active region is important. And lastly, it seems that we should start trying to look at subclasses of active regions, because it seems that there is this distinct difference happening in this emergence process. So I still think convection is likely to be playing a large role, but it may be different for different active regions. And moving towards tighter constraints, I think we have to move to statistical averages of the subclasses. What do these differences in flux emergence rate, if this is what it is, mean? And I don't know this yet. And also looking at quantitative comparisons, which these were just so successful, to other numerical models. So can we look deeper? Can we look at active regions formed by convection? What I haven't talked about is how this all plays with Joy's law. So we need to explore this, and I've just left that as a hint at the bottom. So I'd like to hear your feedback. Thank you very much for sticking around at this strange time for an HAO colloquia, apparently, and listening to my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for a very nice talk. And now we open for questions. So while we wait for questions from the audience, I have a question. I got a little confused about two slides. At the very beginning, you showed a slide that showed the divergent flow in the sunspot, and later on in your in one of the simulation, you showed the bipoles and convergent flow. So yeah, that one, the center, yeah, that one is showing divergent flow, and in a later slide somewhere where you formed two bipoles, there the flow was convergent into the center of the two bipoles.
Right. So this is from the simulations, this 500 meters per second. Sorry if that wasn't clear. That was from the simulations. And this is from one active region. So we didn't think it was fair to compare to an average of active regions. We compared it to single active regions where we don't see anything. But once we start averaging the observations, so we increase the signal, reduce the noise, we average over a number of active regions. So this is 57 active regions, 13 hours before emergence, we see this inflow. So we only see this if we average the active regions. Does that make it clearer?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. And this is from simulations, and this is from the observations.
Okay. Matthias?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. So basically this inflow you show here, is that only coming from the active region which have these pre-emergence BIPO available? So if you take those out, this inflow pattern goes away, right?
So yes, that's what I think at the moment. So we are working on taking those pre-emergence regions out and seeing if and looking at how we average these. And so then there may be two different samples. So we see that in these regions there is an inflow. So maybe this is not exactly the way to classify, there's not clearly outflows and clearly inflows, or clearly no flows. So yes, I think that inflow we see is predominantly due to these regions.
And then follow-up question, I mean, it's a little bit the chicken and egg problem, which is first, the pre-emergence BIPO or the flow, or what's the relations? It's, I mean, kind of the really puzzling thing is that you seem to see a pre-emergence signature in the regions which actually have a downflow, which is kind of
Exactly.
intuitive.
Exactly.
On the other hand, I was thinking, if you do have a bipole, or at least some concentration of flux lasting for a long time in the photosphere, that typically always happens in downflow regions.
Exactly.
So
there's some bipoles that are affected by the flows, and they're floating around between supergranules, which is not surprising. We see this. And then all of a sudden they turn into an active region. So these ones happen to be in inflows when they turn into active regions. But perhaps the stronger ones, which don't have this pre-emergence bipole, emerge wherever they like. Maybe, and it's something to do with the flux emergence rate, their rise speed, I don't know. Yep.
Other questions? Oh, sorry. Yeah, please continue. You were saying something.
Oh no, it's okay. Please.
Okay.
I could talk about this all day.
Any other question?
But yeah, if anyone has any fun simulations of sort of, I don't know, horizontal field being brought up by the convection, maybe this is what we see more here, and this is more of an active process, and we have a distinct difference between two samples, because we arbitrarily define an active region as something that causes darkening at the surface. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, if not, let's thank our speaker again for a very nice talk, Hannah, and thank you for adjusting the time.
Thank you for adjusting your time. It was lovely to see everyone. I'm trapped on an island, so it's always lovely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Hannah.
Bye.